Okay, so now we're going to talk about Locke's empiricism. And essentially what we're doing now is saying, well, Locke critiqued this notion of innate ideas and the rationalist tradition of epistemology, and so we need to see what he's going to offer as an alternative, right? Because if one of his major criticisms was that we don't need to postulate innate ideas to explain anything. Empiricism can just explain everything that we need. So we need to actually analyze what his alternative is and see if it's worthwhile. So rationalists, as we've already discussed, believe there are some beliefs we have which won't be justified by an appeal to our experience. Empiricists, on the other hand, think that every belief we have, at bottom, will be justified by an appeal to experience. So, if you're playing the why game with a child, right, every time somebody asks why you believe something, you give them a justification and you keep going, keep following the chain all the way down. And at bottom, Locke and other empiricists claim that you're ultimately going to justify that whole entire chain of beliefs by some experience you've had. So how does this all start off? Well, Locke initially thinks we come into the world as a blank slate, or in Latin, tabula rasa. Right? So there is, we all come in as this tabula rasa. There's absolutely no information on us, right? So there's a nice little picture of a blank slate there. So that's a good sort of analogy for how we start in the world. So when we come out of the womb, when we're born, we're just blank, right? But the second we start experiencing things, our slate gets filled with a bunch of content, right? So even as an infant, the second we come out of the womb and start seeing things, we're already being filled with experience. We're not choosing to, it's just that the second we get the perceptions coming in, it starts to fill our slate in. And I guess this could happen even in the womb if I'm not sure how we characterize some of those perceptions, but if you're perceiving things in the womb, then those would be filling your slate as well. But the ultimate point is that we all start off completely blank. There's nothing there yet. If you were a rationalist, you would think that a child in the womb or a freshborn infant already has some knowledge with it. It didn't need to start perceiving things to gain knowledge. Maybe God just had already written some knowledge into our brains, right? So that's a really important point. Locke thinks we're all starting off as these blank slates, and then experience quickly starts to give us the material we need to work with. So how do we get ideas? Right, so for the rationalist, it's pretty easy, right? We already have some, and then we can use experience as well, right? So the rationalist isn't claiming that we never use experience. They're just saying there's some beliefs that don't rely on experience. So the rationalist already has a bunch of tools. What does the empiricist have? Well, here's how Locke thinks we form all of our ideas. We start off with these simple ideas, and we get simple ideas through the senses. And really, this is just what we get when we're perceiving things, right? So when we touch something, when we hear, smell, or see something, we're gaining all of this raw material from our experiences. And these count as simple ideas. And it's important, we don't actually choose to receive these ideas. We just simply receive them, right? So it's not like we're choosing to have perceptions of the world. We're just passively receiving perceptions from the world. So examples of things that count as simple ideas would be things like whiteness, hardness, sweetness, etc. Same on for all the colors, textures, tastes, so on and so forth. So these are all very simple ideas. We don't get a lot of content from them, but we do get the raw material we need to start building all of our other ideas. And this notion of building ideas or getting other ideas comes to us from Locke's notion of complex ideas. So roughly what's happening here is he thinks we can take all of that raw material we get from our simple ideas and perception, and then we can use our mind to take those simple ideas or the raw material and build new ones, right? So our mind is a powerful thing. It can actually create ideas from the simple ideas we get. So some examples of complex ideas here are listed. A birch tree, a unicorn. You can compare between objects. We'll talk about this more in just a second. But roughly, see the level of complexity here, right? So a unicorn, when we first see a unicorn, obviously we will never see one, but if we could see a unicorn, we would get all of these simple ideas coming in, right? Like a shape, whatever it smelled like or felt like, the idea of whiteness, whatever the color of its horn is, like a grayish maybe. We could feel the horn and get this idea of hardness. And then when we put all of those simple ideas together, we would get the complex idea of a unicorn, right? So even if you thought we could never get the all the material from the same place, that's okay. If we witness a horse somewhere, witness a horn somewhere else, our mind can take the simple ideas we get from each of those encounters, put them together into one big complex idea of a unicorn. So the important thing to think here is that, or the important thing to notice is that all of our ideas have to come from one of these two processes, right? We either get it through perception or our mind takes what we get from perception and builds new ideas. So if we have ideas of these really complex things like God or the existence of an external world, then we're going to have to eventually be able to describe it by these processes. And we'll talk about how you might do that a little bit later. Okay, so let's say some more about complex ideas. All right, so Locke doesn't think the mind can just do absolutely anything it wants. He thinks that the mind has this power of reflection, and that includes a number of sort of sub-powers. So one power of reflection is that we can take a bunch of ideas we have already. So these could be simple or complex, but it has to be stuff we already have. And then we can join them together. Right, so we already talked about how this might work with the idea of a unicorn. Right, we can have this complex idea of a horse that we've already built, and then get this simple idea of whiteness, and maybe other complex ideas such as what a horn is, and then throw them all together, join them. And then we get this new idea. We get this new complex idea of a unicorn. Another way reflection might work is we can bring ideas together but hold them separate in our minds, right? So we're not combining them here. We're just bringing them together, and basically this is our power of comparison, right? So I can get my idea that James is taller than Daniel because I can bring together my complex idea of James, my complex idea of Daniel, and I don't have to join them. I hold them separately from one another, and then I can study the differences and similarities that each idea has. And so now I have this new idea, right? That one object is taller than another. And then finally, our brains can use this power of reflection to abstract and form new ideas. So how does this work? Well, we have these general concepts or general ideas of, we'll use the example of a cat here, right? So when I say, hey, cats exist, I'm not talking about any particular cat. I'm saying there's this general thing called a cat, and these things exist. So what's happening here? Well, our brain is taking the particular simple ideas and complex ideas we've had and do have of the cats we've seen throughout our life, and abstracting away from each of those particulars to build a very general idea. Right, so let's just say we've seen two particular cats. Right, we've seen the cat Mr. Snuffles and the cat Bob the cat. And so we can take both of those ideas in our mind, and let's imagine there are a few more cats, right? So just say there's 5 or 6 cats there. And we can take each of those complex ideas and notice that they all have something very similar to one another. And we can abstract away from each of those instances and form our general idea of a cat. So this is the brain's power of reflection. It can do a lot, right? So just through these 3 processes, we can take all of the simple and complex ideas we already have and build a whole slew of new ones, which are can range from sort of complex to infinitely complex. Okay, so the next thing we need to know is that Locke thinks there's this distinction between primary and secondary qualities. So when we experience objects, we experience a number of things, right? When we perceive an object, we perceive a bunch of information about it. What color is it? How dense is it? What's the texture? How many is there? Is that object in motion? We experience all that stuff. Now, Locke thinks there's a distinction to make. He thinks that some of those qualities actually describe or represent the object, right? They're a true description of how the object actually is. So, for example, he thinks primary qualities are the qualities that represent the objects as they actually are. Some examples of these will be solidity, figure, extension, motion, and number. Then there are secondary qualities, and these are qualities that the object produces ideas of in our minds, but they don't actually represent the object. The object doesn't actually have these qualities. And so examples of secondary qualities are things like colors, sounds, tastes, odors, and felt temperature. So he's going to think primary qualities are true of the object, secondary qualities are somewhat like an illusion. We do see them when we look at the objects, but they don't properly describe the object. So now we should be asking, well, why should we believe this? This is pretty weird talk, right? So first, Locke wanted this distinction so we could make sense of some scientific findings. So in his time, they had already discovered that objects appear to have a color, but this isn't actually due to the object being that color. It's due to the motion and reflection of minute particles, right? So it's due to the way light reflects off of different surfaces and interacts with our eyes. And so Locke thought we could make sense of these scientific findings by making this distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Now, just because he wanted this distinction doesn't mean it actually exists, so we have to see why we should believe in such a distinction. And here Locke gives us a number of reasons to believe this distinction actually exists. First is the example of the grain of rice. So Locke says, take a single grain of rice and divide it in half. Does it still retain all of its qualities? Well, that seems true. It's still going to be whitish. It's still going to be the same texture. It's still going to smell the same. It's still going to be a single grain of rice. It's still going to have all these different qualities, right? Whether they're primary or secondary. Now he says, keep dividing it, and keep dividing it, and keep dividing it. At a certain point, the grain of rice, at one of its many divisions, will change color. It will also change its texture. It will change its smell, so on and so forth. But it won't change any of its primary qualities. It won't change in number. It won't change the idea whether or not it's in motion. It won't change the idea that the rice has extension. So Locke wants to say, well, if it keeps all the primary qualities and loses all of the secondary, well, then the primary qualities must truly describe it. The bucket of water example just says, hey, if you stick one hand in some ice, one hand near a fire, and then stick them both in the same room temperature bucket of water, then it's going to feel different to each hand. But the water isn't actually two different temperatures, right? So this secondary quality of temperature or temperature feel is illusory and can lead us astray. So the secondary quality must not actually be describing the object. But we could get the primary quality of literal temperature through a thermometer, and then that would correctly describe the object. So that's why he thinks we should believe in secondary versus primary qualities. And now you've seen Locke's entire different setup, how his empiricism works, and how we're supposed to build all of our ideas if we're an empiricist. Next, we'll look at a secondary empiricist named David Hume and see how his alternative